All right, I think we will make a start. So welcome to this third edition of Researching Refugeedom. So this is an event run as part of Breaking Barriers Refugee Week, organized by the University of Leicester. My name is Pascal Roussel. I work for the Sanctuary Seekers Unit, and I'm one of the organizers for our Refugee Week. So in the background helping me, I've got my colleague Alex Palanak, who is head of Sanctuary, and I've also got Julia Marova, who is our Sanctuary program administrator. So before we start, I will just briefly go through a few housekeeping rules. So you will not be able to unmute yourselves. So please use the chat box to share any questions and comments. The reason why we are not letting you unmute yourself is to make sure you don't accidentally appear in the recording, which will be uploaded to our YouTube channel later on. So if you have any issues or concerns, you can also send a private message to Julia Marova, also using the chat box. Please be kind and respectful. And as I mentioned, we're recording and you will receive a link to the video as soon as it's available, probably a week after the end of our Refugee Week. If you have any queries following this session, feel free to email us at sanctuary@le.ac.uk. And now I'm going to very briefly introduce our speakers. So we have three people who will be talking today. But before I do this, if you would like to just say hello in the chat box and tell us maybe who you are, where you're joining us from, any institutions, if maybe you are an academic or work in a university, that would be fabulous. So we know a little bit more about our audience, and it's easier for our speaker, to address you and make sure they deliver the perfect presentation. So we are joined today by Eva Hanna from University of Glasgow, Dr. Ellen Lloyd from University of Plymouth, and Sue Williams from King's College London. So as you can see, the whole of the UK is represented. All right, and now I will leave the floor to Anna, who is our first speaker.
Okay, hello everyone. Today I'll be presenting some progress from my ongoing PhD research project. I'm in my third year and still working on my data analysis. As such, I'll be sharing just a few preliminary findings. My research is funded by the ESRC and the Scottish Graduate School of Social Science via the education pathway at the University of Glasgow. As I was first proposing my research project, I came across Alex Palanak's paper titled Renaissance of the Gatekeepers, in which she and her English teaching colleagues reflect on their roles as university gatekeepers, recognizing that with the power to exclude also comes the power to include, and that a gate is designed to be opened as well as closed. As I continue my literature review, I discovered the work of anthropologist Laura Nader and her concept of researching up, in which she famously argues, instead of asking why people are so poor, we would ask why other people are so affluent. Therefore, I adapted my question for my own study. Instead of asking why forced migrants struggle to access universities, I asked why universities make it so difficult for them to do so. To be very clear, my choice to research the gatekeepers means that I do not collect data from forced migrants themselves. This is not an oversight. I strongly encourage people with lived experience with forced migration to carry out such research, and for others to critically reflect on the power dynamics of giving voice to marginalized groups. My research asks 8 interconnected questions. From this slide, I'll cover numbers 1 and 3. That is, what groups are working online to promote access to higher education for forced migrants in Scotland and the wider UK? And specifically, what groups focus on English language barriers? And question 3, what platforms or technological mediators do these groups use to used to act collaboratively. Next, as my research is primarily about language, and specifically English language barriers, I ask, according to the groups I've identified, what language-related barriers do forced migrants face in accessing university in the UK generally, and Scotland specifically? And what language policies support or enforce these barriers? Next, I explore the ideologies, language-related and otherwise, that underpin these policies and barriers. And perhaps most importantly, I investigate the extent to which the identified groups comply with, resist, or work around such policies and barriers. I briefly address each of these language-related questions in the slides that follow. My research draws on several theoretical areas, which are language policy and planning, linguistic anthropology, and Latourian actor network theory. In the context of language policy and planning, the ethnographic approach allows the researcher to investigate any or all levels of the policy process, from the macro planning level to the micro implementation level. Importantly, it can capture the agency of policy actors, how they interpret and appropriate policies, and how they frame their actions from their own point of view. Classic ethnography is multi-method by design and typically involves participant observation, interviews, field notes, and document analysis. Though I've done many interviews and written copious field notes, the sample analyses that I'm sharing today are based on observation and document analysis. Regarding participant observation, I've actively participated in the groups I've observed based on my past professional experience in EAP, and I've offered my skills as a researcher whenever appropriate or useful. My ethnographic field, as I've conceived it, is a network of individual organizations or groups linked by the common theme of widening access to universities for forced migrants. Each organization or group is led by a coordinator, each of whom I've invited to become key informants in my study. Each group does most of its organization through email plus other online communication platforms, that is, as opposed to in-person meetings, etc. The online nature of their activities is due to the geographic dispersion of the members across Scotland or the wider UK, and not due to the pandemic per se. 2 out of the 3 groups are UK-wide, but I focus mainly on key participants based in Scotland. So to begin with my first research question, I've identified at least 2 groups promoting university access for forced migrants. The first is Universities of Sanctuary, including their Scottish branch, and the second is Refugees, which caters to the language-specific needs of forced migrants. I will explain the purpose and activities of these groups as my presentation progresses. Before I continue, though, it's important to clarify that these are not the only groups working in this area. If other groups are not included in this analysis, it may be that I struggled to gain access as a researcher to their activities, or that I had access but failed to secure permission to collect data from them. Such are the realities of ethnographic research. In my analysis, I've identified 3 main English language related barriers to university in Scotland and the wider UK. The first is a lack of funding and policy to support forced migrants with aspirations to attend university. The second is the testing and assessment barrier for admission. And the third is the relative lack of free places on pre-sessional English for academic purposes, or EAP programs. Briefly, before I continue, for those of you who may be unfamiliar, EAP is qualitatively different than general English, or ESOL, because it focuses on speaking, reading, and writing in an academic context, as well as the generic study skills which students require for success on their future degree program. I'll explore each of these barriers in more details in the next slide. Regarding my 6th research question, while there are no language-specific policies to support forced migrants with university aspirations, there are general policies that act as barriers to most students from non-English language majority countries. These fall into 2 categories. government language policies, and university language policies. Next. I'll start with language policy at the UK government level. The main policy affecting international applicants requiring a student visa involves evidencing knowledge of English. The UK government, or UKVI, thus divides applicants into two dichotomous groups: those who need to prove knowledge of English and those who don't. Those who don't are determined by a list of countries considered to have English language majority populations. Those coming from countries not on this list are required to sit a secure English language test, or CELT, such as the IELTS exam, or to have gained secondary qualifications in the UK before the age of 18. However, this policy does not apply directly to forced migrants who hold very different immigration statuses. Nevertheless, the student visa policy will come up again in my analysis. Next, at the university level, I present the University of Edinburgh's explicit and transparent language policy document, excuse me, which is available online for anyone to read. We can see that their language policy closely aligns with, or in other words, explicitly complies with the UKVI policy presented in the previous slide. Sorry. Next slide, please. Here, I can happily point out an exception to the lack of language policy with forced migrants specifically in mind. The text in bold shows that the University of Edinburgh offers a free in-house CELT for applicants with refugee or asylum seeker status. However, as it will be discussed later in my presentation, this exception is a result of the work done from the bottom up, or implementation level, as opposed to being top-down policy. Next slide. Now I'll present an example of my data analysis from my first observed group. On their website, the Universities of Sanctuary describe themselves as a network of, quote, university staff, lecturers, academics, and students working to make higher education institutions places of safety, solidarity, and empowerment for people seeking sanctuary, end quote. I followed their work for long before my data collection started, and I've attended their in-person conferences in 2019 and 2023, as well as their online conferences amidst the pandemic lockdown. Jumping briefly to question 3, Universities of Sanctuary and Scottish Universities of Sanctuary use a combination of technologies to collaborate. Next slide. The Universities of Sanctuary GIST mail was initiated in November of 2018, and is a major channel for the organization's activities, as I will show in my analysis in the next slide. I uploaded the entire corpus of GIST mail messages to NVivo for analysis, where I used an exhaustive keyword search to identify all emails mentioning language-related issues. Here I summarize the results of the messages related to the language testing and assessment barrier, which I present as actions. I further organized these into 3 basic categories, including those related to the IELTS exam, alternatives to the IELTS exam, and an other category. The other category included themes related to qualification benchmarking, minimum score requirements, erroneous overcompliance, and general inequality issues. Next slide. From the analysis in the previous slide, I can begin to answer my research question number 8. Some actions reflect a resignation towards the IELTS exam, and instead focus on subsidizing, providing, or signposting additional support for forced migrant applicants. Other actions represent the development of in-house alternatives, such as the University of Edinburgh's English Language Education Department, while others link to refugee-friendly alternative assessments, such as Duolingo or Password. Finally, other actions challenge inequalities related to testing, call for more research, or seek to educate others against so-called overcompliance issues. Importantly, the overcompliance issue shows that even though the UK government policies for international student visas don't technically apply. In fact, forced migrant applicants are often directed towards financially prohibitive and logistically challenging SELF, such as the IELTS exam. Next slide. Now I revisit research questions 5 and 6 regarding access to EAP courses. At the UK or Scottish government level, there are no specific language policies directly addressing the language needs of forced migrants with university aspirations. In Scotland, there is public funding for general EFAL, some of which is delivered at further education institutions, but this provision is geared overwhelmingly towards basic integration and immediate, if not low-skilled, employment. Of course, the 2018 through 2022 New Scots Refugee Integration Strategy includes an action plan to, quote, identify possible gaps in relation to preparation and orientation for academic study, to enable students to access further and higher education, unquote. Nevertheless, New Scots is only a strategy and not an enforceable act or policy. Sorry. Meanwhile, at the university level, there are established policies for admitting forced migrants based on their specific legal statuses. Regarding language requirements, there is no policy excluding forced migrants from EAP professionals delivered by English language departments. However, these departments offer limited numbers of scholarships, which in turn must not exceed the equally limited number of scholarships offered by the university itself for a degree program. Therefore, one could argue that effectively, EAP is with very few exceptions open to full fees paying international students. This is arguably an example of de facto policy. Next slide, please. When it comes to the EAP barrier, refugees is the main group I've observed. The purpose of refugees is to, quote, facilitate the development and implementation of pathway to higher education English language provision for refugee background students, with a particular focus on English for academic purposes. Next slide. And to return to my third question, refugees perhaps uses the widest array of technological platforms, as you can see from this list. Next slide. Since early 2022, the Refugee Working Group has used MS Teams along with email and other platforms to collaborate amongst members. The working group is further divided into 4 objective subgroups, which focus on communications and network building, evidence gathering, advocacy, and creating new systems. I myself participated in the evidence gathering group, for example, by presenting on my visit to a university integration program abroad and building a repository of relevant academic literature. Next slide. From textual data I gathered from refugees, I returned to my research question number 8. For example, in a Google document titled How to Advocate for the Development of Sanctuary Provision, I found examples of compliance, workarounds, and resistance. EAP tutors, to a necessary extent, comply with both government and university language policies. However, they also propose workarounds and resistance. Examples of workarounds include appealing to a given university's upper-level management using its own language. That is, the language used in its strategies, in its stated strategies, goals, etc. Resistance, on the other hand, takes the form of pushing back on false concerns or double standards maintained by university management or the larger public. Next slide. Finally, for this last part of my presentation, I addressed my 7th research question. First, I discussed the language ideologies, which I argue uphold the testing and assessment barrier. To do so, I bring in a recent study by Pillar and Bodie, 2022, carried out in the very similar Australian higher education context. Their analysis revealed a binary between university applicants considered to have inherent English language proficiency, or ELP, on the one hand, and tested ELP on the other. Inherent ELP is linked to citizenship, heritage, prior education, and roughly maps onto Katru's 1985 model of world Englishes, consisting of inner, outer, and expanding circle countries. This model, they argue, is in turn influenced by language ideologies, such as native speakerism and standardized language, in which native speakers are ideologically constructed as the possessor or owner of the correct language, which sees standard varieties of written languages as the only legitimate language in schooling and public life generally, with perhaps unsurprisingly, the global standard being British and American English. Ratiolinguistic ideologies, on the other hand, ideologically construct named languages as internally homogeneous or separate bounded entities, while at the same time semiotically linking language and race. And lastly, linguistic deficit ideologies, in this specific context, focus on deficiencies in English proficiency, while ignoring the multilingual repertoires and skills possessed by many forced migrant applicants. Returning to my own research questions, it's clear that forced migrants generally fall into the tested ELP category. However, they undergo a further bifurcation, as I discuss in the next slide. Forced migrants and typical international students are both flagged as ELP, but those that can pay fees for EAP courses can buy their way past this barrier. Now, we can simply take this for granted, or we can ask, why is this the case? The answer comes down to neoliberal and market ideologies that increasingly shape universities' policies. These are supported by economic discourses, hierarchies of deservingness, and marketing strategies. In their work on widening participation across the 4 UK nations, Donnelly and Evans, 2019, explained that policies reflect 2 different approaches to university access. On the one hand, liberal or neoliberal democratic principles focus on leveling opportunity of access, with any failures in the face of such supposed equal opportunity considered the result of individual effort. Socially democratic principles, on the other hand, are concerned not only with removing barriers to equal participation, but also fixing the system to ensure equal outcomes. In my study, access to EAP for forced migrants is arguably based on neoliberal democratic principles, in the sense that any applicant can technically access EAP courses. However, with extremely limited scholarship, only the so-called best and brightest will make it across the barrier. A socially democratic model, on the other hand, would focus on a human rights base as opposed to economic approach to higher education access. And indeed, this is a conversation I've started to hear in my recent fieldwork. Next slide. Here, I conclude my presentation with a summary of my preliminary findings. With respect to language policy and planning, I find that my participants act as de facto language policy actors in a policy void for forced migrant applicants. I also find that several ideologies, both linguistic and economic, mediate language policy in the context of university access for all applicants. Finally, I find that my participants, while largely constrained by neoliberal marketizing forces, nevertheless engage with and contest ideologically mediated policies from the bottom up with their creative workarounds, which is in itself an act of resistance. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Eva. All right, so we now move on to Helen Lloyd, who is going to talk to us about her research around mental health for refugee people.
Hello, everybody, welcome. So I'm going to talk to you about the Roots to Wellness project, which has been funded by the National Institute for Health Research to develop a peer support-based model to improve refugee and asylum seekers' mental health and well-being in 2 sites in the UK, in Plymouth and Gloucester. And what you can see on this slide in front of you is the product, one of the products of an art workshop that we conducted with refugee and asylum seekers in Plymouth to ask them what they understood the project to be and to try and present their ideas of hope and integration in their new settings. Next slide, please. So just a little nod to the core team. We have quite a large team which spans Plymouth, Exeter, East London, Kings and Oxford. But the core team basically is myself, Kristen Niabo, Deborah Westlake, Hoida Darkle and Wen Yu. Our original funding was based on a title which we deliberately chose to get the attention of the funders. It was called Forced to Flee. And through our ongoing engagement with the refugee communities and participants in our respective settings, we've learned that we want to project a more positive image of what the project's about. We're very much based on people's strengths and resilience, hence the Roots to Wellness as the new title. Next slide, please. So this is our wider team. We have Professor Rachel Tribe, who is a psychologist, a clinical psychologist working with refugee and asylum seekers. We have San Marani, who's a professor in spatial practice at the University of Plymouth. Dr. Celia Edwards works for our local partner, which is Live Well, which deliver refugee and asylum seeker mental health services in Plymouth. Dr. Avril Bellinger founded our NGO partner in Plymouth called START, which is Student and Refugees Together. We have Adele Owen, who is our lead for Gloucester, who manages GARAS, which is an NGO organisation in Gloucester that provides support. We have Professor Glenn Robert, who is a medical sociologist working at King's, who's developed the methodology that we're using in the project, which I'll talk about shortly. And we have partners who run current peer support models in the community, but for non-refugee and asylum seeker population. Dr. Alnor Abdullah is also a co-applicant on the team, and he has gone through the refugee journey himself and had been previously a support worker in Plymouth. So we have this broad multidisciplinary team with lots of community partners, Plymouth City Council, NGO partners and health providers, which have brought this project together over the period of the last 3 years in order to gain funding. Next slide, please. So this is a truly collaborative project based on participatory action research processes, which value the lived experience and expertise of everybody that we're working with, be that service providers, refugee asylum seekers. And we work together to define what the issue is, what the issues of importance are for the community, and then gain funding and then develop a solution to that problem. The Roots to Wellness project has been funded for 30 months. And it broadly falls into these following 3 phases. So during phase 1, we call this the discovery phase. This is where we talk to people, understand their experience through conversations and group conversations and observations of current contact between NGO partners, statutory providers and refugee and asylum seekers to understand their areas of need and their articulation of how they talk about distress and what they would like from current services. So that's called the discovery phase. We then move into phase 2, which is due to commence in May of this year, where we create collaborative workshops to take the discovery findings and develop what we're going to call the peer support model. So this will be the training, the manual, the approach, and anything that supports the peer support worker to do their job in the community. And then when we move into phase 3, which will be at some point next year, we will run a pilot test of the model in Plymouth and Gloucester. So that's a sort of very simplified overview of a quite complex project. Next slide, please. Before I move on to talk about what we've found so far, I want to just introduce this idea of co-design. So it's a well-established approach to creative practice. It's where we bring people together from a range of different settings, backgrounds, key stakeholders to create a formulation which becomes a solution to a problem that we've identified in the community. And this idea comes from this notion of equity, where if we want to change and enhance proper solutions that are meaningful to stakeholders, then we need to work with people rather than to people. So it's not about being done to, it's about being worked with. And you build collaboration through the project with citizens to bring in their own expertise and experience in the central design process. And what this means is that you can create agreement, collaboration all through the project and impact through the project rather than waiting for the outcome of the research. So you create a partnership that will hopefully be a lasting partnership, which is why we've, and I will give you further detail shortly, engaged in different types of community groups that run alongside the co-design project. You're bringing people together to share their insights. And the idea is that you use a range of tools and techniques to support the co-design process. So for example, we might be using storyboards, user journeys, vignettes, we might use material objects, we might use art and creative activities to try and use different ways to creating a sense of understanding across divide, particularly where we're finding that we have multiple linguistic groups, multiple ethnic and cultural groups. It's a way of trying to bring different techniques together to express something that is incredibly important to the nature of the thing that you're trying to design. So co-design uses this idea, which is about working together using a range of different tools rather than the kind of existing approach to research where researchers and academics sit around, look at theory, develop and elicit insights, and then write a report and wait for it to be disseminated. So it's very active and it's based on this idea of co-design. Next slide, please. The important things to think about when we're talking about experience-based co-design is that it's human-centered and collaborative, and it's about solving problems. It's iterative and it's practical, and it doesn't involve this kind of neat sequence of events. It's a lot messier than we kind of anticipate. And getting funding for this type of research is quite difficult because funders like to see a very clearly laid out design when it comes to research. They want to know exactly what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. But in this kind of emergent design, that's not always possible. So telling the story of what you're going to do and then actually doing it can become quite different things. Next slide, please. So this is where we are in terms of our project. We suffered quite a long delay in getting our contractual agreement signed up, but we're now underway and we have ethical approval. We've started to collect data for our discovery phase and completed our conversations, our focus groups, and our observations of practice. So we're now trying to think about how we co-design workshops, so how we enact the workshops, carry out the workshops, but how we design the workshops so that they are compassionate and productive to people who may not be used to this type of way of working. So we're co-designing the co-design, which adds another level of complexity. But over May, June and July, we will be developing our program theory of how the peer support worker model might work and what benefits it might convey, what challenges might be present, and how best to tell that story of benefits. So that's looking at our kind of program theory. We will also break up our peer support model development into training, support, mentoring, and approach, and then look at how, or if at all possible, it is to manualize that. There'll be further workshops actually that also look at how we use creative materials as the refugee-facing materials to help them understand what the project's all about. But essentially, when we get to stage 3, phase 3, we'll be recruiting peer support workers from the local communities within Plymouth and Gloucester who've suffered forced displacement but have settled status and that are well enough and stable enough to be trained and paid to deliver the model. We'll then test feasibility. Next slide, please. So this is where we are at the moment. We're collecting data, and I think we're in the situation where we're understanding how people are articulating distress and the sort of aspects that they're asking for in terms of their need for services. So phase one has been about talking to service users and providers and observing practice. As I said, we've been thinking about and asking people how they understand what health and mental health, and we'll be looking at their existing use of services. So this is where we've worked really closely with our NGO partners, and our two core researchers, Wen-Yu Wu and Hoido Darkle, have spent around 4 months just engaging in different community activities to build trust. We've learned that using the word interview for people of an asylum seeker and refugee background has been, could be quite triggering. So we've renamed this data collection method a conversation. And it's going to different community groups, taking part in art workshops, English language classes, where we've seen people come together where they already have trust and relationships, and using those opportunities to collect data rather than bringing people together who may not know each other and would be naturally just mistrustful of those situations. Next slide, please. So the co-design workshops to develop the various ways that this model might be enacted will take place in Plymouth and also in Gloucester. And the way that we're thinking that these might work is that we'll be initially splitting off refugees and providers separately, so that they have smaller focused workshops where they can work more intensively with the materials, and then we will bring people together with support and interpreters to work on that kind of more co-design process. And all the ways in which we engage the refugee and asylum seeker population and our providers has been underscored by an ongoing relationship of engagement and participation and public involvement. So from the very beginning of designing the title, the artwork, the way that we approach people, the language that we use, the principles that we are guided by when we conduct conversation has all been developed through experts by experience who are co-designing the whole process with us. Next slide, please. So these are some of the pictures that are images that represent the kind of co-design participatory action approach, where you bring people together and you use different kind of stimuli to think about that issue that it is you're trying to understand. So post-it notes, everyone kind of is familiar with coming together in a workshop and brainstorming and using post-it notes. In experience-based co-design, Lego has also been used, and card sorting games, images, and these are particularly important with people who are maybe struggling to understand English and require interpreters. And essentially, the idea is that you bring people together, you elicit as much lived experience, expertise as you can in the room, and you work through that process in a collaborative, trusting and engaging way. So these are some of the things that we're probably going to be using as we move forward. We've recently just had a workshop where we co-designed our first workshop with refugee and asylum seekers, and what they've asked is that we they can bring in aspects of their material culture that they've brought with them into the workshops, and we can identify touch points alongside those material artifacts. So touch points is a really key aspect of experience-based co-design, and it's based on this idea that if you want to change something or improve something, you need to kind of emotionally connect with the providers of those services by using narrative-based sources. Of course, narrative relies very much, well, it tends to rely very much in English language speakers on the written word, but we're going to try and build representations of narrative using other objects to try and create that kind of emotional response in service providers. Next slide, please. So when we've worked through our initial workshops to develop the model, we'll have a sense of a kind of prototype. And in that prototype, we will take forward these ways of articulating or expressing touch points and explore the relationship that these phenomena have in creating people's thinking and behaviours in relation to developing the model. We're quite, we acknowledge that very early on in the process that the prototypes are going to be quite maybe ugly or messy, and there's going to be quite a lot of kind of communal head scratching, and it's going to be almost like a fuzzy front end. But this really explains the red herring, I think, that's inherent in experience-based co-design, because you're designing experience, but you're also designing collaboration. So the product of bringing people together in the workshops, yes, of course, we're going to have the output, which is the model, but it's also bringing services together and communities together that have not previously connected. So in some of our workshops, we've learned that some of the NGO providers have never actually met some of the statutory providers, even though they might refer people back and forth to services. So whilst the end product is the creation of the peer support model, the process going along that way to connect people is also incredibly important. Next slide, please. So we are at that stage where we have this kind of emerging idea of what it is we're going to be doing, but we're nowhere near the refinement stage yet. When we get to phase 3, which will be at some point towards the end of this year, the beginning of next year, we will have an approach and some training and support to deliver the model and test its feasibility. Next slide, please. So this is just a little bit of detail about who's going to be involved. Where in Plymouth, we have 2 research fellows. We have LiveWell, who's the mental health service provider. We have StarUps, who's an NGO working in this space. And we have funding to recruit peer researchers who are based at LiveWell to create a link between the research and also the peer support workers in the community and LiveWell and START. So by peer researcher, we will be training somebody who has refugee status in research methods, action research methods, to help us bridge that gap between services. And we'll have 3 support workers in the community. Next slide, please. Likewise, in Gloucester, we'll have a peer researcher and 3 peer support workers, and will be supported by Gareth in Gloucester. So in terms of the workshops, we will bring together START, Devon and Cornwall Refugee Service, Plymouth Council, participants that have taken place in our previous discovery phase, and anybody in the local community that has a vested interest in this issue. There'll be members of the research team, members of lived experience, and members of our local wider reference group, which is our impact group in the communities in Plymouth and Gloucester that's been set up to help us feed our insights back out into the community, but also understand the context of what's going on in the changing landscape of refugee service provision. Next slide, please. So the fundamental features of experience-based co-design are not a prescriptive way of doing action research, but a relentless focus on the experiences of patients, service users and staff. So designing experience is key. It's transformative in the sense that participating in co-design is part of the broader form of value, as I just mentioned, and that what we're trying to do is change culture as well as creating a product or a service. So by bringing people together and sharing, collaboration, dialogue and empathy, it becomes part of the way that we seek to improve compassionate services. So maintaining the focus on these features is really more important than this kind of prescriptive process of advocating a one fix for doing experience-based co-design. So this is a slide that the Design Council have put forward. There's some animation on this slide, Pascal. And what we've tried to do here is show how our project maps onto this double diamond of the Design Council. So in the discovery phase, we have our focus group conversations, our one-to-one conversations, but also our observations of current practice between NGOs, service providers, and people from the refugee community. We then move into our defining phase, which is where our workshops come together to try and pick apart and understand what it is we've learned through our discovery phase. We then move on to our development phase, where we take the next stage of workshops forward to produce something that's tangible that we can take forward. And so the project largely sits within this kind of discover, define and develop phase of the Design Council's Double Diamond. Once we have an acceptable model, we can then move on to broad scale testing in the broader community. So you can move on, Pascal, thank you. One of the things that's really important about the project is that it's been built on engagement and co-production from the very beginning. We started in 2018 working with the local community to understand what it was that refugees and asylum seekers really needed when it came to service provision. We then worked through that process to get the funding, and then we're still working through that process to develop the project. So it's been an iterative project of co-production from the start. It's heavily been focused on engagement, observation, embeddedness within our local organisations, and peer support workers will hopefully be part of that space when we get to delivering and testing the model. We've had to grapple with lots and lots of issues along the way about how to not be tokenistic, how to deal with ethical practice in people who've often been extensively vulnerabilised, but also focus on people's strengths and their abilities within what we hope to deliver the peer support model will achieve. We are providing mobile phones, childcare and payment for all sorts of engagement throughout the project, which I think is really incredible and important for the refugee and asylum seeker population. We have, as I said, engagement throughout. Next slide, please. So what we've learned from our data collection so far is that there are lots of ways in which lots of barriers that we've discovered in the refugee and asylum seeker population in terms of seeking support. Fear was prominent in all of the conversations that we'd had with people. Fear of accessing services, mistrust of services, fear of stigma in the local community, but also stigma in the kind of broader setting. We found that quite a lot of the misinformation in relation to what was happening to prevent people from seeking any kind of help was happening online via members who were similar in some way to the people that we'd spoken to, whether it be linguistically, culturally, or by gender or host community. And we found that social media was particularly important in feeding misinformation. So we, for example, accessed a women's language group where we conducted a focus group, and many of the women in that women's language group were really scared about accessing statutory services because they were told via social media channels that if they access services, they would lose their children. So any triggering of statutory involvement on a health-based criteria would potentially involve losing their children. So this kind of fed further into this mistrust of services and drove most of the people that we spoke to in those early conversations to try and find some sort of other spiritual support or religious support in the community, which they would then find to be less stigmatizing and more in line with perhaps seeking statutory service support. We found that there was a lot of informal social support in the community that fed into social media, but also challenged social media. And what was encouraging about this, I think, was that it enabled us to think, well, if there's peer support going on in the community, then there is something there that provides immediate access to support. Although these people obviously were not paid and were struggling with the boundaries of providing that support. Next slide, please. These are really emergent findings, we have more analysis to do and more data to collect in Gloucester, so they are subject to change. But what we've heard continually around how people express distress and their approaches to engagement were around physical manifestations, sleep patterns and sleep problems, fear of sleeping during the night, fear of loud noises, tearfulness, poor diet, isolation in relation to fear of engaging with others in the community, but also statutory services, and fear, paranoia, and mistrust. Those are the constant themes that are coming out of the data that we've analysed so far. What we've also found in terms of the approach from the NGOs and the statutory providers are that, refreshingly, they take a very individualistic approach to working with refugee and asylum seekers. They try to avoid diagnostic categories and spend a lot of time building trust. They favour gentle and relational approaches and try to deal with a hierarchy of needs before going to deal with anything in relation to mental or serious mental distress. We found that working with interpreters is incredibly complex in local small communities where people are worried about anonymity and the sharing of personal data. So we've also heard that there is a need for formalised support for peer-led community models, which sit in between the more statutory secondary mental health provider space, which is obviously not relevant for a whole range of people that experience mild distress. And that they told us that what they want is boundaries that are supported, support and access to counter misinformation, linking with multi-agencies for kind of joined up person-centred approach, empathy and understanding, someone who understands where they're coming from with lived experience, and a degree of advocacy, signposting and reassurance. That's my final slide. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Helen. So we're going to take a very short break since this is a long session. So we'll be all right. Welcome back. So we are now going to move on to Sue Wellman's presentation. So I think this is a subject we're all a little less familiar with, which is climate migration. So going beyond our usual scope and considering an issue that's likely to become more and more important, in the current context and global warming. Sue, are you with us? Are you ready?
Yes, I'm good to go.
Wonderful.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to start by taking you back to the end of the last century and telling you a little bit about myself. So in 1996, when I started working with refugees and asylum seekers, I was at Hammersmith Law Centre, and the then Conservative government decided that in order to reduce the numbers of asylum seekers coming to the UK, does that sound familiar? They would force them into destitution. So hundreds of asylum seekers were arriving in the UK and denied any support. They ended up sleeping on park benches, begging, eating out of dustbins. And so as a solicitor at the Law Centre, I was involved in bringing lots of judicial reviews to challenge the government policy. And at that time, the community, lawyers, academics, faith groups, trade unionists came together to press for changes both in law and policy so that asylum seekers had access to food and shelter, to their socioeconomic rights. So I think today's discussion and the fact that there is a refugee week at which we talk about breaking barriers is incredibly important in March 2023, when we have a Home Secretary who has decided to basically block entry to UK through the main route over the Channel, effectively denying the right to claim asylum seekers, the ability to claim asylum at all. And on a personal level, I'm now working in the law school at King's, where I've set up a human rights and environmental law clinic. And in the clinical work, which crosses departments, geography, academics, anthropologists, for example, work with us. I'd like to talk about bringing together the idea of environmental law, human rights, environmental law with migration. So I'm going to start by talking about the very idea of a climate refugee, and then I'm going to move on to talk a bit about a project which we've developed, which is based in India. So my question on the next slide is it possible to claim asylum based on climate change? Those working in asylum will, of course, be familiar with the 1951 Refugee Convention. And at that time, the concept of climate change no doubt existed, but we didn't understand it as such. So there's no language for a climate refugee in the original Refugee Convention, which I've quoted here. There's no concept of being able to claim asylum based on a climate situation. But at the same time, we're now in a situation where the majority of the world's refugees live in places affected by climate change. For example, 870,000 Rohingya fled to Bangladesh. Bangladesh is becoming uninhabitable because a third of the community lives along a low-lying coast. And it's predicted that 10% of the population, 13 million people, will have been forced to leave by 2050. And like migration and seeking asylum in general, migration's often to neighbouring countries. We know that most refugee countries are next to the countries that people have fled from. Look at the refugee camps in Sudan, for example. And it's also important to think about the countries from which those who end up in the UK are seeking asylum. For example, Afghanistan's a country which is very much affected by climate change, as is Somalia. So moving on from the question about the lack of a right to claim asylum on based on climate change, I wanted to talk about climate migration and the numbers. And as you can see on the next slide, the numbers have been bandied about are quite shocking. Pascal, are you able to move on to the next slide? Hi, sorry, somehow my university's web link seems to have crashed. Hopefully we'll be okay. I'll carry on. So yes, another stunning statistic comes from the Institute for Economics and Peace. They suggest that 1.2 billion people will be at risk of displacement by climate change by 2050. However, it also thinks that most people will be living in countries that lack climate resilience, but will not move to the global north. They will stay in neighbouring countries. And the World Bank thinks that the figures closer to 125 to 216 million people moving internally in low and middle income countries. It doesn't actually talk about how many people are going to move internationally. So if we go to the next slide, the difficulty that you can see from these figures in quantifying climate-related migration is because of the complexity of the reasons for movements, the nature of the movements, the fact that much of the displacement is local, inverted commas, is often internal. For example, 1.7 million people have moved in the US because of climate-related disasters, because of the lack of data, and because of the issue that we started with. There's not really the definition of what a climate refugee or a climate migrant actually looks like. But we know that people are moving already because of climate change, and that people are going to continue to do so. So we need to think about it in our in the way that we develop the law and policy. It's not clear what's going to be the driver to that movement: sea levels, economic issues, or political instability. But I think we know that it's likely to be the poorest or the more prosperous migrants that move. And we also know that many migrants won't be able to move very far at all. They'll be stuck facing climate-related challenges. So I wanted to go back to the issue about the law and whether or not there's been any legal cases talking about what a climate migrant is. It's interesting that there isn't any clear law on this, but there has been development in the UN Human Rights Committee, which is discussed in my next slide. So there's a man called Mr. Teota, and he left an island called Kiribati and migrated to New Zealand and claimed asylum. The situation in his island, which is called Tarawa, had become increasingly unstable and precarious because of sea level rises. There was a lack of fresh water. Lots of the land had eroded, so that was resulting in land disputes, which were resulting in violent conflicts. And he sought asylum in New Zealand, but received a negative decision. And then he made a claim to the UN Human Rights Committee. And they issued this landmark ruling in 2020, which is the first and most publicised decision on the issue of what is a climate refugee. Unfortunately, they found that the New Zealand Immigration and Protection Tribunal had made a correct decision. They didn't think that the decision should be changed. However, more usefully, they did decide to issue guidance about the circumstances in which climate change could lead to a claim that there's a violation of rights, the right to life, under Article 6 of the ICCPR. So I think if we move on to the next slide, they spoke about the two types of climate change migration. So there's the idea that intense storms, flooding can cause an immediate short-term migration, but then there are slower onset processes which are more long-term, which lead to movement of people seeking protection. They talk about the way that the state responds to climate change and how receiving states should consider their obligations under the ICCPR, so that there'll be a non-return obligation. And they talk about the risk of small island states in particular, where a whole country can become submerged underwater, and in such extreme circumstances that could lead to a violation of the right to life, and so justify a climate change based claim. So that's the background on climate migration. Now I wanted to turn to the project that we've been working on in the Sundarbans. So if I take you to West Bengal, which is just below Calcutta in India, the Sundarbans crosses both India and Bangladesh. It's an amazing biodiverse area of forests along the river, the delta of the river Ganges. There are turtles, there's the Bengal tiger, there are dolphins, there are lots of rare flora and fauna. But this area is very vulnerable to climate change because of sea level, which is rising at more than 3 millimeters a year. It's also hit regularly almost every year by cyclones. And if you can imagine that the community is living along the sides of the river, so it's very vulnerable to the cyclones. And some of these tiny islands on which people live have started to disappear. The first one in 2007, but other islands are at risk. And every time that a cyclone hits, at least 1,000 people can lose their homes in an area which is populated by 4.5 million people. And those people end up in places like Dhaka and Bangladesh, garment factories, probably producing some of the clothes that we're wearing today. At least one person in every 5 families is estimated to have migrated. So people might migrate first from Bangladesh to India, across the Sundarbans, and then they might leave the Sundarbans and migrate to cities. So just looking at some of those families briefly at the next slide. Here's a family who've already migrated to Sagar Island. Sagar Island is itself threatened by being completely submerged, by being flooded. And on the right, you can see a description of how land's destroyed. This was by cyclone Amphan during 2021, during the middle of COVID. And the effect of those cyclones is that seawater comes in and the land is then salinated, and then it becomes impossible to continue their traditional agriculture on the land. People are forced into shrimp farming to export shrimps to places like Europe and Japan and the Middle East. But that then poisons the antibiotics and chemicals used in that then poison the land, so it can never be used for agriculture. So just if we go on to the next slide, we've talked already about how Bangladesh is anticipating 13 million migrants, and just wanted to emphasize this point that those working with refugees already know that the burden of migration often and refugees often falls to the neighboring countries, if we look at Syria, for example, but that's particularly the case in relation to climate migration. So how might universities intervene in that kind of situation? I started to become aware of the Sundarbans through an Indian lawyer who's a barrister who's worked there, and he works in migration. He's an immigration lawyer, and he was interested in this phenomenon of climate change forcing people into migration. And we decided to set up a project called the Sundarbans Climate Justice Project, which has evolved during COVID, assisted by Zoom. It didn't break down like it had today. So if we look at the next slide, I can talk to you about the partners that are involved in the project. So it was very important to us to have, rather like Helen has described, the people affected and the people closest to the issue to be working in developing our project. And so we've been working with universities in Calcutta, in India, both environmentalists and lawyers in developing the project. We've also worked with aid organisations, community-led aid organisations that are working with the community, with lawyers in the UK and in India. And the project is also very much led by students, both in India and in the UK. So last year, students at NUJS, which is the University in Calcutta, organised a climate-related conference to look at the Sundarbans, and they invited tiger widows from the community. Those are women whose husband's been forced to go into the forest and have been killed by tigers, and also many of the other kinds of partners that we're talking about. So yeah, the community from the area trying to work together with academics, journalists, lawyers, to start by raising awareness of their situation as an example of how climate change that's caused by many of us in the global north is impacting the global south, but secondly, to try to seek remedies for it in the form of legal actions brought against fossil fuel companies and people financing fossil fuel companies. So the project started by trying to map the situation. And as you can see in the next slide, Indian students went to conduct a field visit with, I suppose, environmental scientists who had been going to the region to look at climate change. And I'll talk in a bit about the difficulties, but just to give a very vivid example, one of the people that the students met said, "How long is this interview going to take? Because I need to go and stand in a queue for food, their equivalent of a food bank, and if I'm late, may not get any food." So people are really living in a very disaster hit situation, which is difficult when we were trying to conduct our research about what the community needed, that kind of gap between people's day-to-day living situation, what you might be trying to achieve in the longer term. So, but we managed to meet with communities and to prepare reports, which we launched with various proposals about where we might go next. And these were the things that we were trying to do. We're trying to raise awareness generally in the global north in the UK about the impact of climate migration by telling the story of those people. There are lots of issues arising from it. For example, people having earlier marriages for economic reasons as a result of climate change, women who are forced into the sex industry because of the impact of climate, or sex trafficking through, forced to go to the city, or even a cross boundary to the city as a result. We wanted to empower the community and try to increase their access to justice. Basically, they don't have any access to justice at all. We also hoped that our students would be affected by what they saw and what they worked on. So not every student's going to go and work for Greenpeace, but if students are working in corporations, advising mining companies in their future careers, then we would hope that they might have a different perspective about how they did that, and about ensuring that companies apply human rights due diligence and environmental due diligence in relation to those kind of situations. And then if we move forward onto the next slide, talking about some of the challenges, as I mentioned, the situation is so extreme that interventions are quite difficult. Perhaps there's a parallel sometimes with asylum seekers who've arrived in the UK when you want to start working forward, and they don't know if they're going to have to leave their hotel tonight or whether they're going to have enough food. But it's difficult to plan longer term solutions and policy interventions when you're faced with an extreme situation. It was important to us that we weren't kind of the global north parachuting in, that we tried to work in a decolonial way, but we found that the legal cultures within the university culture was quite different, the way that students worked and were expected to work. So that has been a challenge and a learning process. We also faced an issue about the rights of people in the Sundarbans in conflict with the rights of nature. So, for example, World Wildlife Fund is focused on the rights of the tiger, conserving the biodiversity, and they have a project which aims at displacing people. So that was something difficult to navigate. It's been hard to attract resources to work on a project which is aimed not just at research, but at kind of operational changes and having a kind of direct impact, funding legal interventions. That's been hard. So if anyone here's got any ideas about that, they'd be gratefully received. And then, yes, this is a question I'd like to ask Helen as well. There's that idea of an expectation once you start engaging with communities as a lawyer or as a academic, you might be seen as having ability to make change, which maybe you can't make, or you don't know if you can make it or not. Or on the other hand, people might have given up hope and might have met a lot of people and might feel, what's the point of this? So those last 2 points really come into conflict with one another. I'm nearly at the end, but I just wanted to talk about the next directions. So Pascal, can we go forward one? Yes, I suppose one thing we learned was we had to slow down a bit because the community didn't even have a language or a concept of climate change. They might see something as God's will. They certainly might not have a concept of climate migration. So we needed to start at school levels, working with the community and talking to them and listening to them. We went down an unexpected route of developing a module. So we're now teaching a joint model between India and the UK, where we have a classroom in the UK and a classroom in India, and we join up by a kind of hybrid classroom. So that's been kind of an exciting development. And then the Indian students will go and hopefully do some clinical work in the community. I mentioned that we're working with the local council to bring a complaint against the multinationals that are financing fossil fuels. And we continue to try to talk about what's happening there, as I have tried to do today, and hopefully interested some of you. So just a final slide. I just wanted to make a link between the idea of the Refugee Week and refugee work in the UK, and there's some information sources here working on this issue. And lastly, to mention a couple of the NGOs that are working in the Sundarbans, trying to adapt and support the community. Thank you very much for inviting me and for listening.
Thank you very much, Sue. Thank you to our three speakers. So if anyone has got any questions, this is now the official time, and I will pass over to my colleague, Alex Palanak, who will pick any questions that come, and I think she may have some herself, and we'll do a little bit of a roundup of this session. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much to our three speakers. They were focusing on three very different areas of research, three different disciplines, but all incredibly informative and incredibly topical. So thank you so much for coming and sharing your research with us today. So yeah, I mean, I have a question to kick things off while other participants might be writing their questions in the chat. So my question is really to Helen and to Sue, and it's about how you look after your own well-being as a researcher, because both of you, Helen, your research is focusing on mental health and well-being, and Sue, yours is focusing on climate change and kind of the difficulties, the very practical struggles that people are facing because of this. And so I would imagine this would have a real impact on your own mental health and the mental health of your team. So yeah, I was just wondering how you kind of grapple with that as researchers.
I'm happy to go first. Yeah, it's any kind of relational research often has an impact, and on the team and on, you know, and on the participants. So we've set up, as I mentioned, some guiding principles for how ethically we'd work with refugee and asylum seekers in different ways. And there's multiple levels of engagement for that. So that was as much as being mindful of protecting the participants as well as protecting ourselves. And so there's a careful attention to language and boundaries, and ensuring that there are things that we don't need to know about for the purposes of the research. So we don't need to know what someone's status is. We don't ask people to talk about the events that led up to why they left their home country, although inevitably they do. But it's that we're taking a trauma-informed approach, both to participants but also towards each other. And so some of the practical things we're doing is we're having debrief sessions after any events that involve interaction around the phenomena, the data, or with participants. And I've set up a session with a clinical psychologist, so that we have group reflective sessions once a month, but also the researchers can go and meet with the clinical psychologist on a one-to-one basis should they need that kind of level of clinical support.
I suppose that the main way in which we approach this is through the initial training with the students. So because we're teaching clinical skills, we talk about interview skills and ethics with the students before, and then we have reflection sessions afterwards. So there's a chance to reflect on what's happened and why it happened and learn from it. On a personal level, I think it's important to have a kind of supportive work environment, but having, worked with vulnerable people in my work as a practitioner, I think the thing that helps me most is the feeling that you can contribute to making a difference, and working with activists and survivors of very difficult situations has been really enriching for me. I have worked with people from the Middle East whose families have been tortured or are still in jail and detention, and they carry on fighting a struggle for human rights and democracy. And they really give me kind of hope and strength to continue this important work that we're all trying to do in relation to human rights and the right to seek asylum and be free from torture and mistreatment.
Thanks very much. Yeah, so it seems like it's a bit of a mixture of putting in place systems as part of the research process to encourage to kind of brief people at the beginning and to have a chance for reflection afterwards. And like Helen, you mentioned talking to a psychologist afterwards if somebody feels that they need to do that. but then also kind of drawing kind of strength and inspiration from people around you who are doing something to something about the situation. So it seems like a bit of a mixture there. Great, thanks very much. Okay, so we have another question that's just come through in the chat. So this one is for Helen. And the question is, I think the collaborative model you describe is so interesting and exciting, but also quite challenging to implement. How easy do you think it would be to use this model more widely to support refugee communities across the UK?
Thanks for your question, Frances. Yeah, I mean, this type of approach is challenging, and it's the first project that I know of to use an experience-based co-design approach with refugee and asylum seekers. So watch this space. I don't know is the answer whether it will be something that we can implement more widely. Although what I will say actually is that action approaches in general, which is where EBCD kind of comes from as its root, are about relationships and trust. And so I think if you've got that and you honour that in a meaningful way, in a non-tokenistic way, those are kind of some of the ingredients that makes these things possible. And it's all about people, isn't it? I mean, it's all about, so our engagement lead, Kristen, works with people in a way that she just gets people intrinsically. So she will support all of the refugee and asylum seekers. She'll work with them with pre-meetings to prepare them for our workshops. She'll meet with them to check in and to check that they understand the whole process of the research and the different elements of the research. So they get a lot of support and mentoring going through. And I think that's really key, not only in terms of understanding the research process, but in terms of managing expectations and boundaries around working collaboratively. The other thing that's a real draw is that there is mutual benefit for both, well, for all of the key stakeholders involved. And I think surfacing what that benefit is quite early on and having that sort of key throughout the whole process is a success criteria. So the service providers are getting insight into how to improve their services. They're getting help with how to understand commissioning models and how to write commissioning briefs. The refugee and asylum seekers who are taking part are getting paid for the data collection. They're getting training for the workshops, for the peer support work models. They're getting certificates. They're improving their English language. So action research creates benefit through the process of doing it rather than waiting for the outcome. And I think that is the only ethical way that we can work collaboratively with very vulnerabilized populations. So I think those are some of the things that give me hope that we might be able to implement it more widely.
Okay, thanks very much, Helen. Okay, so we haven't got any further questions in the chat yet, but please continue to post questions in the chat if you do have them. In the meantime, I have another question for Sue. So you mentioned that you're going to be taking, or you're kind of helping the communities take legal action against fossil fuel companies. I was wondering how successful those sorts of legal actions tend to be, just out of interest.
So the clinics are not allowed to do litigation. We use soft law processes. So companies in developed states are part of something called the OECD, and they have guidelines which say that companies need to conduct human rights and environmental due diligence. So our plan is to complain to the National Contact Point, which is run by a government agency, about the company, and the process is that the company is then asked to mediate with the community about the complaint. Obviously we're not going to bring an end to climate change through the complaint, but I think that the purpose of such complaints is that it puts pressure on companies, it can lead to publicity, it gives some kind of voice to a community that may not have a voice. Well, for example, in a completely different context of the Middle East, people there who are protesting about human rights violations brought a complaint against Formula One for still running the car race in the middle of the Bahrain whilst somebody had been shot by the police and other people were being tortured in jail. And that led to mediation between the human rights activists and the Formula One. So, the process, assuming the companies engage in the process, I think it can have an impact. But much of what I think is part of what's important in the field of migration and climate change, I suppose, is about changing hearts and minds and having public on behind you, so that hopefully then you can get the changes to the law and policy, which will make people's lives a bit easier.
Thank you, Sue. And yeah, and well, I really hope that that you are able to, raise awareness through this and that the case is successful.
Thanks.
Just looking at the chat, so no further questions have come through. So I think we will kind of start wrapping up a few minutes early. So just to say again, a huge thank you to all of our speakers. There's been so much food for thought in all of your presentations, and also actually so much value in bringing these three kind of different presentations together, because it kind of it helps us really shine a spotlight on different common ways of working that have kind of gone through the three presentations, the different things that you need to bear in mind when working with refugee populations, some of the complexities as well when dealing with people with research participants who, for example, might need to be waiting in a food queue. And so that sort of thing, how do you kind of factor all of that into your research process? And also what resonated with me was this idea of building trust with refugees, with individual refugees and refugee communities before really starting to get into the research process. That came out really strongly. Well, another thing to mention before finishing is that so this has been a session as part of our Breaking Barriers Refugee Week. We have a couple of other sessions coming up this week. We have an event on the Ukraine crisis and a model of working between different UK universities to approach welcoming Ukrainian students to the UK and twinning with Ukrainian partner universities. We also have an event on Friday on a concept called service learning, which actually links quite nicely to something which Sue was talking about in her presentation. So service learning is basically kind of embedding into a curriculum a credit-bearing element where students do something to help others, to help communities, for example, whilst gaining valuable skills. And we're going to be using a case study of law students as part of that. So that seemed to kind of link quite nicely to what Sue was saying about her own law students on the project and the skills that they were gaining and the difference that they were making to people's lives. Well, I think that's about everything. So just thank you to everyone today for coming, and thank you so much again to our three speakers. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.